I never expected that the night would change everything. New Year's Eve had always been a special occasion, one that was spent in the warmth of family traditions and hopeful resolutions. I had no reason to think this year would be any different. But as the night unfolded, I began to feel a gnawing sense that something was wrong, something deeper than the usual holiday stress. My wife, Rebecca, was unusually distant. She had been quiet for weeks, a strange unease hanging between us. I told myself it was the pressure of the holidays, juggling work with the chaos of Christmas. I didn't want to believe anything else, but every moment felt like a shadow creeping closer. Still, I smiled, pretending everything was fine. Our daughter, Emily, ran around the house with excitement, eagerly awaiting the countdown to midnight. Rebecca's attention seemed to drift, her laughter louder than usual, but forced. I assumed she was just trying to push through the awkwardness. Maybe it was my own paranoia playing tricks on me. But then, as the evening wore on, I started to notice something I couldn't ignore. The way Rebecca and my uncle Alan exchanged glances when they thought no one was looking. The subtle touches, too casual, too familiar. I brushed it off, pretending not to see. But inside, a storm was brewing. By the time midnight struck, I was no longer caught up in the celebratory cheer. I had stopped believing in the innocence of what I saw. Rebecca told me she was going to bed early. I thought little of it. Emily was already tucked in, and I planned to catch up on some work before heading to bed myself. The house fell silent as the clock ticked past the usual New Year's rush, but then I heard something, a faint noise coming from upstairs, a low murmur, a laugh that didn't belong. I froze. The sounds grew clearer as I strained to listen. The door to the guest room was slightly ajar, and in that moment, I knew something was horribly wrong. My breath caught in my throat as I heard Rebecca's voice, mingled with Alan's. My own flesh and blood. I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't. But the noise, that unmistakable noise of muffled intimacy, left no room for doubt. They were together. I felt a surge of anger, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, paralyzing numbness. I wanted to burst in there, confront them, demand answers. But I didn't. Instead, I turned and walked back to my office. I couldn't bear to look. I couldn't breathe. That night, I didn't sleep. The knowledge of their betrayal weighed heavily on me. I told myself I would wait for the morning, that I would be calm when I confronted them. But as the hours passed, my resolve hardened. I had been betrayed, not just by my wife, but by my uncle, the man I had trusted all these years. By morning, my mind was made up. The house was quiet, the echoes of their treachery still reverberating in every corner. I wasn't going to beg for answers. I wasn't going to ask why or what went wrong. I was going to make them pay for what they had done. Rebecca came down for breakfast, pretending like nothing had happened. The false normalcy stung more than I anticipated. But I kept my composure. I didn't confront her yet, not until I had everything in place. Later that afternoon, Emily asked me if we could go to the park. Her innocence, her pure joy, only made my anger grow. I tried to keep it together for her sake. We spent the day outside, but all I could think about was the betrayal that had shattered my world. It wasn't just a moment of weakness. It wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate choice. The sun set on the first day of the year, and I knew that my life was about to change forever. The next day was when it truly began. I woke up to the hum of the house, to Emily's cheerful voice calling from the kitchen, but it felt like I was stepping into a world I didn't recognize. The previous night's events had shattered something inside me, leaving me adrift in a sea of confusion and rage. I had always prided myself on keeping my emotions in check, on being the pillar of stability for my family. But now everything felt like a lie. Rebecca and I exchanged the usual pleasantries, the kind that only served to deepen the divide between us. Her smile, the one that had once been so warm, now seemed like a mask. I wondered how long it had been there, how many times she had worn it before. But she didn't know that I knew. She didn't know I had already seen enough to bury her in her own guilt. I kept the silence between us thick and unyielding. She had no idea what I had heard, no clue that I had seen her with Alan. And I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing my hurt, my anger. I wasn't going to show her weakness. Instead, I focused on Emily, giving her my full attention, even though my mind was elsewhere. Rebecca tried to make conversation, as if everything was fine. "What's for dinner tonight?" she asked, setting the table with a false cheerfulness in her voice. I didn't answer right away. I just stared at her, trying to read her. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, but she quickly masked it, looking down at the plates she was arranging. My mind was screaming at me to confront her, to tear down the walls of this fake normalcy, but I held myself back. I needed to be smart. I needed to plan. After dinner, I told Emily I'd take her to her soccer practice, as I had promised earlier in the week. Rebecca didn't question me. I had been distant all day, but she probably assumed it was just one of those moods I got into every now and then. I kept it simple, replying only when I had to, keeping my distance in a way that made her uneasy without being obvious. As we drove to the practice field, I thought about what to do next. I couldn't just walk up to Rebecca and demand answers. No, it had to be calculated, precise. I needed to strip away her defenses, make her admit the truth. But not yet. I wasn't ready. That night, after Emily was in bed, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, staring at the dim glow of the fireplace. I hadn't told her yet. I hadn't confronted her. And I wasn't sure if I was waiting for her to confess, or if I was just savoring the silence, the moment before everything exploded. I checked my phone, needing something to focus on, and that's when I saw it. A message from Alan. It was short, nothing too alarming on the surface, just a casual check-in. But I saw it for what it was, an attempt to keep the secret between us intact. His tone was friendly, casual, everything I had ever known him to be, but now I couldn't look at him the same way again. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. He had already given me all the confirmation I needed. Later, I lay in bed, the weight of the betrayal suffocating me. Rebecca was asleep beside me, her breath steady, completely unaware of what I was planning. I was still angry, of course, but there was something else, something colder, more calculating. A part of me didn't want her to get away with it. A part of me wanted her to feel the full extent of her actions before I let her go. I wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. I waited until the first light of morning to make my move. Rebecca stirred beside me, her hand brushing against mine, but I pulled away, making sure to keep my distance. When she finally opened her eyes, I was already up, moving around the room as though nothing had changed. "You're up early," she said, her voice groggy from sleep. "I've got things to do," I replied, my voice as flat as I could make it. I didn't want her to know how much I was unraveling inside. I didn't want her to know how much I had already planned. I walked into the kitchen to find Emily, still in her pajamas, playing with her phone. She was blissfully unaware of the tension that had been building. I forced a smile, reminding myself that she deserved to stay in the dark for as long as possible. The last thing I wanted was to tear apart her world just yet. Rebecca joined us a few minutes later, trying her best to act normal. I wanted to laugh at how she thought she could hide her guilt. Her every movement was an attempt to feign innocence, but it was as transparent as glass. I couldn't look at her without feeling disgust. I didn't say anything to her, not yet. I would wait until tonight. The night was when everything would come crashing down. As the day stretched on, I made the necessary preparations. I started putting everything together, gathering the pieces of the puzzle that would lay her bare. The footage from last night, the text from Alan, the messages from Rebecca. I wasn't going to confront her without evidence. I needed to watch her face when she realized I knew everything. By evening, I was ready. I had made sure to stay calm and composed all day, but inside, I was burning. My hands shook with the anticipation of what was to come. That night, after Emily had gone to bed, I told Rebecca we needed to talk. I could see the fear creeping into her eyes, though she tried to hide it behind a forced smile. She didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of the end. "Let's sit down," I said, keeping my voice level. There was no room for emotion. Not yet. Rebecca hesitated before sitting across from me at the kitchen table. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice cracking. I pulled out my phone, showing her the video I had recorded from the security camera footage, Alan and her laughing too close, just as I had suspected. I could see the color drain from her face as she realized the extent of her mistake. She opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. Don't try to explain," I said, my voice cold and controlled. "I've seen everything." Her eyes welled with tears, but I didn't care. The anger that had consumed me now gave way to a sense of eerie calm. I had been betrayed by the two people I trusted the most. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about making her understand the weight of her actions. "I want a divorce," I said, letting the words fall like stones into the heavy silence. Rebecca looked at me, her lips trembling, but no words came. She had no explanation. Not anymore. The damage had been done. Rebecca didn't answer me right away. Instead, she sat there, her body stiff, her eyes wide in disbelief. I watched her, feeling a strange calm settle over me. This wasn't the woman I had built my life with. This was a stranger who had shattered everything we'd worked for. Her mouth opened and closed as if she were trying to find the right words, but nothing came. She stared at the phone in my hand, at the video playing on the screen, her and Alan caught in their moment of betrayal. The air between us felt thick, suffocating, and still I said nothing. I didn't need to say anything else. The proof was right there. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Rebecca spoke. "Ryan, please. I didn't mean for this to happen." Her voice trembled, but there was no emotion in it. No apology, no true regret. Just fear. Fear of losing everything. I stayed silent, watching her fidget nervously in her chair. I wanted to reach across the table, grab her by the shoulders, and shake her. But instead, I sat still, letting the silence consume us both. I was lonely, she continued, her words barely above a whisper. I felt so alone, and when he came back into my life. "Stop," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "I don't care about your excuses. You made a choice. You chose this." Her face contorted, and she buried her hands in her face, sobbing now. I didn't flinch. I didn't comfort her. I couldn't. Not after what she'd done. "I'm sorry," she pleaded, looking up at me with tear-filled eyes. "I swear, I never meant to hurt you." I was confused. I thought. "Don't," I snapped. "You didn't just make one mistake, Rebecca. You lied, you deceived me, and you dragged Alan into this. You betrayed not just me, but our daughter, too. You thought you could hide it all, that it would just disappear, but it doesn't work like that." The weight of those words hit her like a physical blow. I could see the realization creeping in, the understanding that this was the end. I was done with her lies. Done with the pretense. I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice shaky now. "But please don't do this. We can fix it. I'll do anything. I'll cut him out of my life. I swear." She reached for my hand, but I pulled away instinctively, as though her touch burned. "No," I said, my voice low but firm. "This isn't about him. This is about you. You've already destroyed everything we had." Her sobs grew louder, but I couldn't afford to feel sorry for her anymore. I'd already given her more than enough chances to come clean. She had made her choice long ago, and now she had to live with the consequences. "I want a divorce," I repeated, each word sinking into the pit of my stomach. It wasn't a relief. It wasn't closure. It was just the reality of what had to happen. "I can't lose you," Rebecca gasped, her eyes searching mine for any sign of softness, any flicker of the love that had once been there. "Please, Ryan, please don't do this to us." I stared at her, my expression unreadable. "It's too late for us. You made sure of that." She looked defeated, her shoulders slumping as she leaned back in her chair, unable to even meet my gaze anymore. I felt nothing but a cold emptiness, a hollow space where the love I once had for her used to reside. "You think you can just walk away from this?" I asked, my voice colder now. "You think it's that simple? That you can betray me and expect me to just forgive you and move on? No, Rebecca. You don't get to walk away from this with a clean conscience. You're going to feel the consequences of your actions." Rebecca's face paled as she realized what I was saying. She opened her mouth to argue, but the words caught in her throat. She had no defense. No excuse could erase the damage she had caused. "Don't worry," I said, my voice growing even colder. "I'll take care of everything. The divorce, the custody. I'll make sure Emily is protected from all of this." Her eyes widened. "What do you mean? What's going to happen to Emily?" "She's staying with me," I said, not flinching. "You lost your right to be a mother when you made that choice. You don't get to break our family and then act like nothing happened." The words were final. They hung in the air between us like a sentence, unspoken but understood. I knew Rebecca would fight me for custody, but I was ready. I had already made up my mind. I would fight for Emily, for her future, for the stability that Rebecca had destroyed. Rebecca's sobs quieted, and she looked up at me with a mix of desperation and disbelief. Ryan, please. Please don't take her away from me. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The truth was clear to me now. This wasn't about her. This was about making sure Emily grew up in a home where trust, not betrayal, was the foundation. The silence between us was unbearable, stretching on for what felt like hours. But I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no going back. The only thing left now was for Rebecca to face the consequences of her actions, no matter how much she begged or cried. I'll call my lawyer tomorrow, I said, standing up from the table, feeling a surge of cold determination. This marriage is over. I'm done. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her there, her tears a reminder of the life she had thrown away. It was over. The door had closed, and there was no reopening it. Rebecca's face crumpled at my words, her hands trembling as she tried to compose herself. The tears in her eyes were not the ones I had expected, not the ones I had wanted to see. They weren't remorseful or filled with regret. They were the tears of someone caught, someone who had underestimated the depth of their deception. She opened her mouth to speak, but I silenced her with a cold, unyielding look. I don't want excuses, I said, the harshness in my tone leaving no room for negotiation. I've heard enough. She stood up, her chair scraping against the floor with a sharp sound, like a final warning. Ryan, please, you don't understand, she said, her voice breaking, but I could see the defensiveness behind her words. It's not what you think. Stop, I interrupted. Don't try to twist this, Rebecca. You can't make this about anything other than what it is, betrayal. Her shoulders slumped as if the weight of my words was too much to carry. She looked like a shell of the woman I had once loved, the woman I thought I knew. But now I saw her for what she truly was, a stranger in the guise of my wife. Why? I asked, my voice quieter, but still laced with the sting of betrayal. Why him? Why Alan? Her eyes darted away from mine, a brief flash of guilt passing over her features. But she didn't answer. She couldn't. No explanation would ever make it right. The truth was simple. She had chosen him. Not just in one moment, but over a long stretch of time, in small, quiet ways, until it all culminated in this. The affair wasn't a mistake. It was a conscious decision. And I wasn't going to let her lie to me anymore. Don't bother, Rebecca. I've seen the texts. I've seen the way you two looked at each other. Don't insult my intelligence by saying you didn't know what you were doing. She staggered back like I had slapped her. The tears came in full force now, pouring down her cheeks, but I didn't feel any pity. The woman I had once shared a life with, the woman I had trusted with my heart, was gone. This version of her, the one who thought she could tear apart everything we had built, was nothing more than a stranger, someone who wore my wife's skin. I love you, Ryan, she sobbed, her voice cracking with desperation. I never meant for this to happen. It was a mistake. Please, let me fix it. I stood up slowly, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. You can't fix this. There's nothing left to fix. Her sobs were more than I could bear, but they didn't change anything. She had already made her choice, and now I was making mine. I was done. The woman I loved was gone, replaced by someone unrecognizable, a liar, a cheater, someone who had broken the trust we had built over the years. Rebecca collapsed into a chair, her face buried in her hands, her body racked with grief. But there was no comfort left for her. The trust had been shattered, and there was no coming back from it. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm that raged inside me. I've already contacted a lawyer. This marriage is over. At the mention of the lawyer, her head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. No, Ryan, please. But there was no more room for negotiation. I had made up my mind. This wasn't about love anymore. This was about justice. This was about protecting myself and our daughter from the consequences of her choices. I don't want to hurt you, I said, my voice flat. But I need to protect Emily. I can't have you in her life if you're going to keep doing this. Rebecca's face crumpled again, her body shaking as she tried to catch her breath through the sobs. I could see her face etched with regret, but it wasn't enough. Her regret wasn't for me. It wasn't for our family. It was for herself. And that was the difference. I couldn't be the one to hold this family together anymore. I had given everything I had, and it wasn't enough. She had shattered the bond between us with a single act of betrayal, and now I had to live with the consequences. I'll take full custody of Emily, I said, the words heavy with finality. I'm not going to let you tear her apart the way you've torn apart our family. The room was silent for a long moment. I didn't know what to feel. Anger? Grief? A mixture of both? But I didn't let myself dwell on it. I had to stay focused, stay strong. For Emily. For myself. Rebecca looked up at me, her face pale, her body trembling. Please, Ryan, don't do this. Please don't take her from me. I couldn't answer her. I couldn't even look at her. The woman I had once trusted had taken that trust and thrown it away. She had betrayed me, and now she wanted me to save her from the consequences. But I wasn't her savior. I wasn't her knight in shining armor anymore. I'm done, I said, turning away. Get your things together. I want you out by the end of the week. I walked out of the room, leaving her behind, broken and pleading, but I didn't turn back. I couldn't. There was nothing left to salvage. As I stood in the living room, staring at the empty space, I felt something shift inside me. The house, once filled with the warmth of a family, now felt like a hollow shell. But the emptiness didn't scare me. It freed me. For the first time in a long while, I was in control. Rebecca's sobs echoed from the other room, but I ignored them. I couldn't feel for her anymore. I had to protect Emily, and if that meant tearing this family apart, then that's what I would do. There was no other choice. The next few days passed in a haze of legal papers, cold stares, and unanswered questions. The air in the house had become thick, suffocating. Rebecca moved into the guest room, but there was no longer any illusion of normalcy. Every corner of the house seemed to echo with the remnants of what had been, of a marriage I once believed would last forever. I spent most of my time in the office, buried in work, trying to distract myself from the reality that was unfolding in front of me. But no matter how hard I tried to focus, my mind would always circle back to the same thing, Rebecca. What she had done, what she had taken from me, and how in the span of a single night she had destroyed everything. The phone calls with my lawyer were never ending. There was so much to sort through: custody arrangements, division of assets, and above all, ensuring Emily's well-being was a priority. I couldn't afford to let Rebecca turn this into some kind of pity party. She had made her bed, and now she was going to lie in it. Emily had been quieter than usual. She could sense the tension, the shift in the atmosphere, though I tried my best to shield her from the worst of it. She kept asking about why Mommy wasn't around as much, why she wasn't staying in her room. It broke my heart to see the confusion in her eyes. But I kept my answers simple, trying not to overcomplicate things. She's just been busy, sweetie, I would say, my voice strained but steady. Sometimes, grown-ups need some time apart. I hated lying to her, but the truth was too painful, too complicated. I didn't want her to feel the weight of what was happening between Rebecca and me. Not yet. Rebecca, for her part, seemed to shrink. She barely spoke to me, except for the occasional plea for forgiveness. But I couldn't listen to her anymore. Every apology she offered felt hollow, like a faint echo of the person I had once known. She was asking for a second chance. I had already given her everything, every ounce of trust, every moment of my love, and she had thrown it all away for a lie. The days dragged on, but there was no resolution, no reconciliation, just silence. Cold, empty silence. Then, one evening, as I was preparing dinner for Emily, I heard the doorbell ring. I froze for a moment, unsure of who could be visiting. I glanced at the clock. It was just after 6, and no one ever stopped by at this hour. I wiped my hands on a dish towel before walking to the door. When I opened it, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. Alan stood there, his face grim, his shoulders hunched as if he had already known what was coming. My blood ran cold, but I didn't let him see how much his presence affected me. I took a deep breath before speaking, my voice clipped and sharp. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my words hanging in the air like daggers. Alan didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there, shifting uncomfortably. Then he looked me in the eye. "I need to talk to you. It's about Rebecca." I resisted the urge to slam the door in his face. I wanted to tell him to leave, to never come near my family again. But I knew I had to hear him out. I knew he was here to face the consequences of his actions, and he had no idea what kind of hell he was about to walk into. I stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. He hesitated for a moment, then walked through the door and into the living room. I followed him, every step feeling like a slow march toward the inevitable. "Sit down," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "I don't have time for small talk." Alan sat down on the couch, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He was uncomfortable. Good. He should be. He had destroyed everything, just like Rebecca. "I don't know how to say this, Ryan," Alan began, his voice low, but I could hear the desperation in it. "I'm messed up. I know that. And I've been thinking a lot about how things went down." I crossed my arms and leaned against the wall, my gaze fixed on him. "You don't get to apologize for this. Not anymore. You've broken my trust. You've ruined my family, Alan. And for what? For a night of whatever it was you thought you had with my wife?" Alan winced, but he didn't look away. "It wasn't like that," he said quietly. "It wasn't planned. I didn't mean for it to happen." I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and cold. "Of course you didn't. None of this was planned, was it? But here we are. A broken home, a shattered marriage, and you think you can just show up and explain your way out of it." He shook his head. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even deserve it. But I need you to understand that I didn't want to hurt you." "Too late for that," I spat, the words escaping before I could stop them. The anger that had been building in me for days finally bubbled to the surface. "You've hurt me, Alan. You've hurt my daughter. And for what? So you could scratch an itch you thought you had with my wife? I trusted you. You were family. And now you're just another man who couldn't keep his hands to himself." His eyes lowered, and I saw the guilt written across his face. "I'm sorry, Ryan. I really am. I never meant for any of this to happen. But I can't take back what I did. I can't fix it." "No," I said, my voice steady, though the weight of his words hung in the air like smoke. "You can't. And neither can she." Alan's eyes flicked to the floor, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But I reminded myself of everything he had taken from me. The trust, the family, the future we could have had. It wasn't enough to fix anything now. "Do you think I should forgive you?" I asked, the words more for myself than for him. That I should just sweep all of this under the rug and pretend like nothing happened? He didn't respond right away. Instead, he just stared at his hands, clearly struggling with the weight of his own guilt. I almost expected him to offer some kind of rationalization, but all he gave me was silence. "No," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think you should forgive me. I don't deserve it." I took one last look at Alan before nodding. "Good. Because I won't." I didn't wait for him to respond. I turned and walked to the door, opening it wide. Alan stood up, but there was no fight left in him. He knew he had lost. He knew there was nothing he could do to fix what he had done. "Get out," I said, my voice cold. "And don't come back." He hesitated, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer before he walked out the door, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I closed it behind him without a word, letting the silence settle over me like a heavy blanket. As I stood there, the weight of the moment sinking in, I realized something. This was the end of it. No more pretending. No more trying to hold together something that had been broken beyond repair. Rebecca and Alan had chosen their path. Now I would choose mine. The days after Alan left were a blur. The house, which had once been filled with the noise of laughter and the warmth of family, now seemed hollow. Rebecca didn't speak to me unless absolutely necessary. It wasn't out of guilt. It was because she knew she had nothing left to say. She had crossed a line, and the finality of my decision had been etched in her face every time she caught my eye. Emily continued to ask questions, but I kept my answers short. I wasn't prepared to explain the depths of Rebecca's betrayal to her yet. I knew the day would come when I'd have to sit her down and tell her the truth, but not now. Not when she was still so innocent, so untainted by the world's harsh realities. It was late one afternoon when the doorbell rang again. I had barely recovered from Alan's visit, and the last thing I wanted was another confrontation. But I knew that Rebecca had already exhausted all her options, and when the doorbell rang, I knew she wouldn't be the one standing on the other side. I opened the door to find my lawyer, Claire, standing there. She was early, but she was someone I trusted, and after the weeks I'd spent buried in legal paperwork, I wasn't going to turn her away. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said, her voice steady, but her eyes were filled with the kind of professional empathy that I had come to appreciate in her. We need to talk. I stepped aside and motioned for her to come in. It's fine. I've got a lot to process. Claire gave a small nod, but I could see the weight of the situation in the way she carried herself. This was no longer about divorce proceedings. This was about saving what was left of my life. I've spoken to Rebecca's lawyer, she said, her voice calm and even. They're not giving up easily. They'll fight for custody. But based on what you've shared and the evidence we've gathered, it's not going to be easy for them. I nodded, knowing full well what Rebecca would do. She wouldn't go down quietly. But I had made up my mind. I couldn't let her win. Not after everything she had done. It doesn't matter, I said flatly. She made her choice. This isn't about fairness anymore. This is about protecting Emily. Claire looked at me for a long moment before speaking. I understand, but just know that the courts tend to side with a mother, especially if she can show that she's trying to make amends. You need to be prepared for them to pull out all the stops. I didn't need her to tell me that. I already knew. Rebecca would try to turn the narrative around, make herself the victim, paint me as the one tearing the family apart. I wouldn't let her. I couldn't. Not after what she had done to me. I'm ready, I said, my voice steady. Let's end this. Claire's eyes softened for a moment, and she placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. I'll handle it from here, she said. I'll make sure everything moves forward smoothly. We'll get you the outcome you deserve. Thank you, I replied, but inside I knew the battle had only just begun. And it wasn't just a legal battle. It was a battle for my soul, for my peace of mind. The next few weeks were a blur of cold exchanges, legal paperwork, and meetings with my lawyer. I had become a man driven by purpose, a man with one goal in mind, to protect Emily, to shield her from the chaos that had been created by Rebecca's selfishness. I barely saw Rebecca. She spent most of her time in the guest room, her presence a constant reminder of the betrayal. There was no anger left in me toward her, not at this point. Just a cold, clinical resolve. She had done what she had done, and now she had to live with the consequences. I had to focus on what mattered now. Emily had begun to withdraw, her once bubbly personality becoming subdued. She would smile at me, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. I knew she was feeling the weight of everything that was happening. It wasn't fair to her. None of it was. One evening, after dinner, Emily turned to me with those wide, innocent eyes that had always held so much trust. "Daddy, why isn't Mommy here?" she asked softly. "Why isn't she in her room anymore?" I froze, my throat tight as I tried to find the right words. "Mommy and I are having some problems, sweetie," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "But I'm here for you. And that's all that matters." She seemed to accept the answer, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. She didn't understand. How could she? How could a child understand betrayal? Understand why her parents could no longer live under the same roof? I had hoped I could shield her from the truth, but I knew it wouldn't be long before she saw the cracks, the pieces of our life that could never be put back together. Later that night, after Emily was asleep, I sat alone in the living room, my mind a storm of thoughts. I looked at the empty space beside me, where Rebecca used to sit, where she used to be. I could feel the weight of it all pressing down on me, suffocating me. This wasn't the life I had imagined for us. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the memories, but they came rushing back, the laughter, the warmth, the moments of love. They felt like they belonged to someone else now, someone who didn't exist anymore. I glanced at the clock. It was late, and yet I couldn't bring myself to go to bed. I needed to feel something other than the numbness that had taken over my life. I needed to take control. With a sudden decision, I stood up, walked to the door, and grabbed my coat. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get out. The walls of the house were closing in, and I needed air. I drove aimlessly, my mind racing. After everything that had happened, after everything I had lost, I still didn't know who I was anymore. I wasn't the man who had trusted his wife. I wasn't the man who had believed in the sanctity of family. I was something else now. Someone else. It wasn't until I found myself at the edge of the city, parked by the lake, that I felt the tension start to leave my body. I sat there for hours, staring at the water, letting the silence wash over me. There was no peace, but there was clarity. When I returned home, I was different. The anger had faded, but so had the sadness. It was replaced by something colder, something more dangerous. I had accepted what had happened, and I was done with trying to make sense of it. The days following my trip to the lake felt like a blur. I had spent my time quietly planning, preparing for what was coming. The divorce papers had been filed, and the court date was fast approaching. I was focused now, focused on the one thing that mattered above all else, getting full custody of Emily. Rebecca tried to reach out, tried to apologize again, but I'd already made up my mind. There was no turning back now. She had chosen Alan. She had chosen betrayal. And I wasn't going to let her waltz back into Emily's life and act like nothing had happened. I knew the court battle would be long. It would be messy, but I was prepared for it. I couldn't let her win. She had made her choices. Now I was making mine. It wasn't until the night before the court hearing that I finally spoke to her again. "Rebecca," I said, my voice calm but firm as I stood in the doorway of the guest room. "This is it. Tomorrow we go to court, and I'm not backing down. This is about Emily now, not about us, not about the past. You don't get to undo what you've done." Rebecca looked up at me, her face pale and drawn. She had stopped crying weeks ago. Now she just looked tired, tired of fighting, tired of pretending like everything could be fixed. But it couldn't. "I know I don't deserve anything from you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "But I'm sorry. I really am, Ryan." I nodded once, but I didn't feel anything. "Not anymore." "I'm sorry too," I said quietly. "But I have to protect her. And I can't do that with you in her life." Rebecca didn't respond. She just stared at the floor, her hands clasped tightly together. I turned away, knowing there was nothing left to say. Tomorrow it would all be decided. The end of one life, the beginning of another. The morning of the court hearing arrived with a heaviness that settled in my chest. I had been preparing for this day for what felt like an eternity, but now that it was here, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was just the beginning of something much bigger. My entire future, the future of my daughter, hung in the balance. The past few months had been a blur of legal proceedings, bitter exchanges, and hollow apologies from Rebecca. I'd gotten used to the distance, the cold silence between us. But today, everything would come to a head.